The train cut through the prairie like a seam ripped through cloth, its smoke trailing in the wind like a dying man's last breath. Esther Granger sat stiff-backed in the second car, hands gloved and clasped in her lap, a carpetbag at her feet, the letter in her coat pocket burned against her chest with the weight of truth too late. Outside the window, the land stretched wide and bitter, endless browns and brittle golds, as though even color had been scraped thin by the wind. She'd been a bride on paper for 73 days. They were to meet in Willow Bend, where her new life waited, a small cattle spread, a wood-framed house with a Linta barn, and Jonathan Granger, the man she'd married by mail after months of tender, careful correspondence. He was steady, his letters said, God-fearing, not one for liquor, not rich but honest. She was not young enough anymore to count on charm or passion. What she sought now was safety. Instead, the last letter had come postmarked 3 weeks ago. It wasn't from Jonathan. It was from a man named Silas Reed. It said Jonathan was dead. Her husband, never seen, never touched, never kissed, was buried behind the house he'd built for her. A fever took him fast. Silas wrote in a plain, unvarnished hand, yet there was something in it she clung to. He'd signed it respectfully, Silas Reed, your husband's dearest friend. The train hissed and groaned as it slowed through the tall grass near Willow Bend's modest depot. She gathered her bag and coat, rose when the car squealed to a halt, and stepped down into the dry heat of a foreign place that smelled of dust and old sun. He was waiting for her, just as he'd said he would be. Silas stood apart from the others, not near the station door, not with the cluster of ranch hands and mail carriers. He leaned against the rail fence at the edge of the yard, hat low, arms crossed, eyes on the ground until he saw her. He straightened then, slow and solemn. His frame was tall, raw-boned. His beard was trimmed but uneven, as if he'd forgotten himself halfway through the task. "Mrs. Granger," he said. Esther nodded. "Mr. Reed." A silence rose up between them, long and uncertain. Behind her, the conductor called for final parcels. Somewhere a mule brayed. A woman in a red shawl laughed too loud. "You came," he said, finally. "I gave my word," she replied. He nodded, jaw working. "Did you eat?" She blinked, "No." "I brought a sandwich, dried beef. It's a ways out to the ranch." "Thank you," she said, not sure whether to take it then or wait. He turned to his buckboard, hitched to a dun mare with an old blue harness. The wheels were nicked and dry, the wood sun-bleached. He lifted her bag into the back as if it weighed nothing. Then he offered her a hand up. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. His fingers were rough, but his touch was careful. He did not look at her too long, nor speak unnecessarily. They rode side by side into the quiet plains, the road rutted and narrow, framed by barbed wire and pale grass. The sun lowered itself toward the edge of the world as if too tired to burn any more. "Did he suffer?" she asked, when the silence became too wide to bear. Silas glanced over, brow furrowed. "Not long. Fever took him in 2 nights. I stayed with him." She looked away, blinking hard. "Thank you." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. "He talked about you, even in the worst of it. Said he was sorry he'd go before he met you proper." Tears threatened, but she pressed them back. She, grieved in the train berth, holding that letter like it might break open and reveal a better ending. There was no use in crying now. They reached the ranch house just as the sky turned copper. It was a squat, sturdy thing, clearly built by calloused hands. The porch boards creaked underfoot. A single oil lamp burned inside. "I'll sleep in the bunkhouse," Silas said, as he lifted her bag to the porch. "You'll have the house." "Was it his?" she asked. He nodded. "Built it last spring." She stepped inside. It smelled of wood smoke and cedar. There was a cot made up with a quilt, a cast-iron stove, a table with 1 chair, and shelves lined with books, mostly scripture and livestock guides. A coat hung by the door. She touched the brim of a hat on a peg, then let her hand fall. Behind the house, a small fenced plot held a white cross. She didn't go to it. That night she lit a candle and sat by the window while outside, the wind combed the grass like a mother's hand. She watched the faint light of a lantern move in the bunkhouse across the yard and wondered what kind of man Silas Reed was. A friend, yes. But what kind of friendship made a man write to a widow not yet a wife, and then come for her, and then wait? He had not looked at her with pity, nor with desire, only something quiet and solemn like respect. Esther undressed behind the screen, folded her dress, and slipped into the narrow cot. The silence of the house settled around her, heavy but not cruel. She thought of the word widow, and whether it applied to a woman who had never touched the man she mourned, whether grief could be real when built only on letters and hope. The candle burned low beside her. She slept without dreams. Morning found the plains wrapped in silver mist, the kind that lifted slow off the earth like breath from a sleeping animal. Esther rose early. The house, though quiet, bore the signs of a man's former life. His boots were gone, but she found a shaving bowl under the washstand, a tin of peppermints tucked into the drawer beside the stove. She touched none of it. She boiled water, made tea with dried yarrow from a bundle hanging near the hearth, and stepped onto the porch. The horizon was wide and pale, and the land beyond the fence seemed to stretch without end. She breathed in the scent of dew and dust. Silas came from the barn carrying a milk pail, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. The mare from yesterday grazed behind him. He nodded at her, said nothing, and handed over a small tin of fresh cream before disappearing into the bunkhouse. He spoke little that first week. Each day he brought wood to the porch, fixed a loose shutter, or returned from town with what supplies he thought she might need. He brought her apples one evening, green and tart, and she stewed them with cinnamon she'd brought from back east. When he came to the door to return a borrowed pan, he stood a moment too long. "You've got a way of making this house smell kind," he said, eyes steady on the worn floorboards. Esther gave a soft smile. "It's the apples. They don't know this house yet. It's me they're trying to win over." He almost smiled. "Then I'd say they're near there." She nodded, not answering, and he tipped his hat before returning to his own quarters. The grave was a presence she could not ignore forever. On the 8th day, just before dusk, she walked out to it. The cross stood in a quiet patch near the aspen windbreak, beside a low stone border that marked what would have been the start of a garden. The name carved on the whitewashed plank read Jonathan Granger, beloved friend. No date, no verse. She knelt in the grass. Her hands trembled as they brushed along the dry earth. "I would have come sooner," she whispered. She stayed until the shadows lengthened and the birds hushed in the trees. When she rose, Silas was standing not far off, watching without stepping forward. "I'll plant something there," she said, "come spring." He gave a single nod. He'd like that. The first snow came early that year, a dusting that melted by noon but left the mornings brittle and white. Silas began chopping wood each day, splitting logs behind the barn with a rhythm that rang out across the land like a hammer on a bell. Esther learned to cook on the iron stove, found her way through jars of pickled beans and dried hominy, and mended the curtains where mice had chewed through the edges. At night she wrote in her journal, words she didn't show to anyone. She wrote about the cold, about the silence between her and the man in the bunkhouse, about how she missed being touched, not with want but with familiarity. One night, after a long cold spell, she opened the door to find Silas on the porch bench, rubbing his hands over a tin mug. "There's talk in town," he said, eyes not on her but on the yard beyond. "People wondering what you'll do." She crossed her arms, bracing against the wind. "Do they think it's their business?" "No," he said, "but they make it theirs anyway." She waited. He sipped the mug, coffee gone cold. "It's not decent, they say, you living here, me there." "It's his house. He married me." "I know, but the world don't draw the line where it ought to." She studied him, the slope of his shoulders, the weathered lines around his mouth. "What are you saying, Mr. Reed?" His eyes met hers then, and something old and solemn moved between them. "I'm saying I can marry you," he said, quiet as the breath before a storm. "Not for love, if that troubles you, not for want, just for what's right, so you keep the land, so they hush their talk." The wind caught the edge of her shawl. She did not answer. He rose then, slow and spare in his movements, and set the mug on the rail. "You think on it," he said. "There's no pressure. I'll not speak of it again unless you ask." She watched him cross the yard, each step firm but not heavy, and disappear into the bunkhouse. That night she lit no candle. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind sigh through the eaves, and thought about the word decent. What it meant in a place like this, where survival came before sentiment, where kindness was its own kind of vow. She did not know if she was ready to be a wife again, not to Jonathan's memory, not to the quiet man who buried him. But part of her wondered what kind of life could grow from something planted in mercy. Not love, not yet, but maybe something close, something that held. She closed her eyes and let the dark hold her. She would think on it. The cold settled deeper as November waned, the nights long and thick with frost. Esther moved through the house with quiet purpose, her days full of small tasks, patching Jonathan's old coat to wear, pickling what squash remained, scrubbing the soot from the stove's throat. But the stillness between her and Silas shifted. He kept his word and didn't raise the matter of marriage again, but something else passed between them in the silence, not quite tension, not quite waiting. She noticed he'd begun leaving his gloves on the porch rail, drying his boots by the house door instead of the bunkhouse stove. He repaired the gate latch without her asking. He added new oil to the lamp each morning before she rose. These things added up like pebbles in a jar, small but counted. Then came the storm. It rolled in from the west, low and mean, a sky the color of pewter pressing hard against the land. Wind howled through the chimney like a mourning cry, and snow came thick and fast until the world vanished in white. It was 3 days before it cleared. On the first night, the roof of the bunkhouse cracked with a loud split. She ran to the door with a shawl wrapped over her head, just in time to see Silas coming through the snow, shoulders hunched, carrying his rifle and saddlebag. "The roof's gone," he said, breath fogging in the cold. "I can sleep on the floor, won't bother you." "No," she said without thinking. Then quieter, "Come in, you'll freeze out there." He stepped in, snow melting off his coat in slow, wet patches. She lit the fire higher, set a pot to boil, made tea without asking. He didn't take the chair. He stood near the window, watching the white world blur. She sat across from him, hands around her cup. After a long while, he said, "You think I'm just doing this out of duty?" She looked at him wary. "Aren't you?" His jaw flexed. He didn't answer right away. "When Jonathan was dying," he said slowly, "he asked me to take care of you. Said you were good and that I was the only one he'd trust. I told him I would, but it ain't just that anymore." The wind howled against the door. "I know what it's like to live alone too long," he went on. "I know what it's like to wake and not have anyone to speak to, and I reckon you do too." She tightened her grip on the cup. "I came here to build something, not to survive on someone's pity." "It ain't pity," he said. "It's respect, and maybe hope." She stood then, heart tight in her chest. "Hope for what?" He looked at her with a steady, open gaze. "For peace, for company, for something good that don't have to be perfect." Outside, the storm shrieked. Inside, the fire cracked low and steady. She didn't say yes. But when she brought him a blanket and placed it on the far cot that Jonathan never got to sleep in, she did not feel like she was giving in. She felt like she was choosing something, for herself, maybe for the first time. The storm passed, and life returned to its rhythm, though now Silas took his meals at the house. They spoke more, though still not much. They moved around each other like trees bending in the same wind. One morning, after she brought in water and found him fixing a broken hinge, he asked again, "Will you marry me, Esther?" She met his eyes. "I still don't know what that means between us." He wiped his hands on a cloth. "It means you keep the land. It means no more gossip. It means we build something together, even if slow." She hesitated, then asked, "Would it be a real marriage?" He didn't look away. "It would be what you want it to be. I won't expect more." She stared past him to the grave in the distance, white and still, then back to him. "Yes," she said. His shoulders eased, not with triumph, but with something like quiet relief. They married in the parlor of the town clerk, with snow still clinging to the eaves. No guests, no ring, just 2 names written in ink and a witness who smelled of horses. Afterward, he tipped his hat to her as they stood on the porch steps. "Mrs. Reed," he said. She nodded, "Mr. Reed." They returned to the house together. That night she made rabbit stew. He set the table. They ate in silence, but it was not the same silence that had stretched between them before. This one was full, almost warm, like something that had begun to breathe. When she cleared the plates, he stood to help, then paused. "You'll sleep where you always have," he said, voice careful. "And I'll stay on the cot. Nothing changes that you don't want changed." She looked at him a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it. Outside, snow fell again in soft, clean flakes. Inside, two people sat across a table, bound by paper and mercy, but slowly, perhaps by something more. By midwinter, the wind became a permanent resident, whistling through chinks in the barn, moaning against the eaves like it had nowhere else to be. Esther patched every draft she could find, sewed quilted runners for the windows, and placed hot stones under the bedclothes before sleep. The routine of the days dulled the sharp edge of grief, though it never quite left her. She and Silas worked side by side now, as if they had always done so. He taught her how to mend harness leather, how to watch the cattle for signs of frostbite, how to break ice from the well without cracking the bucket. She, in turn, mended his torn shirts without asking and left coffee warming on the stove whenever she woke first. They spoke little of the past. There were things buried too deep, his losses, hers, but in their quiet rhythm there bloomed a kind of ease, the kind not born of words but of daily acts, of presence. One morning, Silas didn't come in for breakfast. She waited longer than usual, then stepped out to find him hunched near the woodpile, holding his arm against his chest. Blood soaked the sleeve of his shirt. She dropped the pail in the snow. "What happened?" He didn't speak right away. His face was pale, jaw clenched. "Blade slipped. Stupid mistake." "Come inside," she said sharply. "Now." He didn't argue. She guided him in, stripped the shirt from his shoulder, and washed the wound with snowmelt and whiskey. He sat stiffly at the table, not flinching as she stitched the gash closed with her old needle and thread. "You could have bled to death out there," she said when it was done, her voice trembling more than she meant it to. "I wasn't planning on it." She didn't laugh, she couldn't. Her hands shook as she tied off the last knot. "You need rest." He looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "I'll take the cot." "No," she said, "you'll take the bed, just tonight." He hesitated. "It's warmer," she said, quieter now, "and you're hurt." She brought him water and tucked an extra quilt over him. He murmured thanks, then drifted into a thick, pained sleep. She watched him a moment longer than she should have, then turned away. That night she slept in the chair by the stove, heart wound too tight to rest. The next morning he tried to rise too soon. She pushed him back down. "You're not strong enough," she said. He gave her a tired smile. "You're fiercer than you look." "I've had to be." That evening he asked, "Do you miss him?" It was the first time either of them had spoken Jonathan's name aloud in weeks. She thought for a long time, then said, "I miss the idea of him, what I thought we'd have, what I thought I'd be." Silas nodded, looking away. "And you," she asked, surprising herself, "have you loved someone?" His mouth pressed into a line. "Once she left, said I was too closed up. She was right." Esther wrapped her arms around herself. "This life doesn't make space for softness." "No," he said, "but I think it needs it just the same." That night she brought her pillow and blanket to the foot of the bed, lay there without touching him. She wasn't sure what she was doing, only that it felt less like fear and more like truth. In the morning, when she woke with the edge of the quilt tucked over her shoulders, she realized he had done it in the night. Not with words, not with permission, just quiet care. That was how February passed, slow, bare, honest. She grew used to his presence at the table, his boots by the door, the sound of him breathing in the dark. One night she found herself telling him a story from her girlhood, something silly about chasing a goose and falling into a pond. He laughed, not loudly, but real, and she found she liked that sound more than she'd expected. One morning, while she kneaded dough for bread, he said from across the room, "You don't have to stay once spring comes." She froze, hands deep in flour. "I know," she said. "I mean it," he went on. "This arrangement, we did what we had to, but if you want more, if you want different." She turned, voice steady, "And do you?" He looked up from the bit of harness he was fixing. His eyes were tired, steady, hopeful in a way that had nothing to do with youth. "I want you to stay because you want to, not because you owe anything." She thought of the house as it was now, hers in a way it never had been when empty. She thought of his boots by the fire, of his quiet way of making space without taking it. She thought of how her loneliness had shifted, not vanished, but softened. Endurable. "I don't want to leave," she said. And that, between them, was more than a vow. It was a beginning. Spring was near. The land was still brown and brittle, but birds had begun to return, and the light lasted longer in the evening. Esther planted crocus bulbs at the base of the grave's cross. She stood with her hands in the earth and whispered a prayer that wasn't for Jonathan alone, but for the life she might still live. Not what she'd imagined, but perhaps what she needed. The wind was gentler that day, and in the distance she saw Silas leaning by the barn, watching her, not moving closer but waiting. She did not wave. She simply turned toward him and walked. The thaw came gradual, as if the land had forgotten how to wake. Patches of ground darkened beneath the snow, then spread like spilled ink. Water ran in shallow rivulets across the fields, soaking into long frozen soil. Life returned not with flourish, but in small, stubborn signs: a blade of green, the cry of a red-winged blackbird, the smell of mud. Inside the house, change moved just as slowly. Esther no longer slept at the foot of the bed. One evening, without remark, she folded her blanket and set it in the chest, then lay beside Silas beneath the same quilt. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her, but he didn't move away. They slept like that for weeks. Sometimes their hands brushed in the dark. Once she woke to find his arm over her waist, his breath at her nape. He pulled back with a muttered apology. She turned toward him and whispered, "It's all right." He stayed close after that. In town, they were known as man and wife now. The blacksmith tipped his hat to Esther. The grocer began asking Silas about cattle prices again, as if some silent tension had been resolved. A woman with a blue scarf asked if Esther would come to Sewing Circle next Sunday. "I'm not much for gathering," Esther replied. The woman smiled. "You've earned some rest, I think. It's all right to be known." Esther didn't answer then, but later she told Silas about it. "You should go," he said, sanding a piece of cedar for the fence. "You've been alone a long time." She looked at him. "So have you." He met her gaze, his hands slowing. "I don't mind it as much now." The garden bloomed before the trees did. She planted peas, onions, and a row of marigolds. He built her a trellis from old fence slats. When the wind blew in from the east, it carried the scent of earth and smoke and something lighter. One night in the deep quiet after supper, Silas set down his cup and said, "I think about him still, every day." Esther folded the dish towel. "So do I. I keep wondering if he'd have wanted something else, for you." She sat beside him, close but not touching. He wanted someone to build a life here, to see it through. "You think this is that life. I think we're still building it." He nodded slowly. "I ain't a man for sweet words." "I never asked for sweet," she said, "just steady." His breath caught faintly, as if he hadn't known he'd been holding it. Later that week they rode out to the north pasture. The grass there was tall again, the cattle sleek and full of calf. On the ride back their horses walked close. She reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. He looked down, then over at her. She said, "You can hold my hand now, if you want to." He did, and they rode the rest of the way in silence. Come June, the grave bloomed with the crocuses she had planted. Esther knelt by it with a cloth to wipe the dust from the wood. Silas stood a few steps behind, as he always did, not crowding her grief. She turned and beckoned him closer. "I want to change the cross," she said. "Not the name, but I want it to say something more." He crouched beside her. "What'll it say?" She ran her fingers over the smoothed wood. "Beloved friend, gone too soon, a life that gave way to another." He was quiet a moment, then he nodded. "That's good." That evening he carved the words with slow, careful hands, and she stood beside him in the lantern light, watching chips of wood fall like ash. When summer came, they shared the bed not just in sleep. It happened not with ceremony or confession, but with quiet certainty, hands meeting beneath the quilt, her head tucked to his chest, his breath steady and warm at her ear. When it was done, he kissed her temple and whispered, "You don't owe me anything for this." She looked up at him. I know, and that's why it means something. Love did not come like thunder. It came in the sound of boots on floorboards, in the scent of coffee in the morning, in the way he wrapped her shawl tighter before she stepped out into the wind. It came when she caught him smiling at her over his shoulder while mending a gate, when he taught her to shoot his old rifle, then laughed when she missed by a mile, when he came home early from town with a bolt of blue calico she'd once admired and said, "I thought maybe you'd want a dress just for Sundays." And one evening, as they stood watching the last light go from the sky, he reached for her hand and held it, rough fingers threading between hers. "You said once this was a marriage of mercy," he said. She nodded, "It was. But I think it's turned into something else." She leaned against him, her head to his shoulder. "Yes," she said, "I think so too." The house stood quiet and whole behind them. The wind moved gentle through the grass. And for the first time in years, Esther Granger, now Reed, felt not like a woman waiting or mourning or enduring. She felt like a woman home,